Welcome back to All About Winning Daily Fantasy Sports. My name is Ty Patton. In this video, I will share with you the numbers I use to correlate with identifying the top wide receivers to put in my player pool for my DFS lineups. The wide receiver position has a lot of variance from week to week, and identifying the right wide receivers to put in your DFS lineup is no easy task, as wide receivers represent 1/3 of your total score and more if you choose to use a wide receiver in the flex position. To give an example of the variance at wide receiver, all you have to do is to take a look back at Week 11. In Week 11, these were the top 5 projected wide receivers: Michael Thomas, Michael Evans, Amari Cooper, DeAndre Hopkins, and Julio Jones. The actual top 5 scoring wide receivers were as follows: John Brown, who scored 37.7 points from Buffalo; DJ Chark from Jacksonville, who scored 33.4 fantasy points; Calvin Ridley from Atlanta, 31.3 fantasy points; Michael Thomas from New Orleans with 28.4 fantasy points; and Michael Gallup from the Dallas Cowboys, who scored 26.8 fantasy points. An interesting another thing to look at is the ownership and how it panned out. These were the top 5 in ownership. Number 1 was DJ Moore, and this is for tournaments, larger GPP, but generally the ownership is fairly close. In tournaments and cash in ownership's fairly close. DJ Moore led the way with 21.22% ownership, followed by Deebo Samuel, who had 20.58% ownership. And it's because he was basically a free spot, really low salary last week. People were putting him in their lineups to spend up elsewhere. Mohamed Sanu had 18.72 fantasy points or ownership. Michael Thomas, 15.32% ownership. His ownership was down a little bit due to his high salary last week. He was actually 9,900. And Jamison Crowder was 8.29% ownership. Only one of the top 5 projected and top 5 in ownership was in the top 5 scoring, and that was Michael Thomas. Interesting that 2 of the top 5 scoring were the wide receiver 2 for 2 of the top 5 projected. That was Ridley. He's the number 2 receiver in Atlanta to Julio Jones, and Gallup, who is the number 2 receiver to Amari Cooper in Dallas. These top 5 scoring wide receivers averaged together 12.2 targets, 129.2 yards, and they scored an average of 31.52 fantasy points between the 5 of them. And their team total over-under average was 45.9 points. This is just an example of the difficulty in identifying the right combination at the wide receiver position. The truth is, we cannot predict, but we can use numbers to help give us an edge. And in the end, that's all we're looking for, is an edge. I have developed this chart that you'll see here on the screen to allow you to follow along with me instead of throwing a bunch of numbers at you, which I did in the past, and I realized it was really hard. I had some really good information, but it's hard to follow it and put it together without actually being able to see it. So I encourage you to screenshot this chart, pause the video, use it however you like. And if you don't like my take, these are the real numbers. Do with it what you want, but this is some really good information. I would like to add that I always like to have at least one target with the quarterbacks that I'm targeting, or the quarterbacks that I put in my lineup. The one exception that I have this year, obviously, is Lamar Jackson. But for the most part, I like to have, and even with him, I like to have a target. I'll team him up with Andrews, his tight end, or Hollywood Brown. But for the most part, I at least want to have one target with whoever my quarterback is in my lineup. So without further ado, explain this chart a little bit for anybody who might be new. Obviously, the colors are red is the worst, yellow is middle of the road, and green is the best for that particular category. Meaning, obviously, Michael Thomas isn't a bad receiver. You see the red in the 9,300. That just means the 9,300 is obviously way more than when we go down here to Corey Davis, who's 4,300. It's in comparison for that category. Um, the yellow players, those are ones that I'm kind of on the fence with. I'm going to have them on my player pool. I may or may not use them, but I'll probably have less ownership of them compared to the ones that are in green. And less ownership. I don't mass multi-entry, meaning I don't do the 150 lineups. Not that I have anything against anybody that does that. If I could, I would. If I'm ever in the position to do it, I'll be doing it. It just makes sense. You develop a player pool, use an optimizer, and it just makes sense. You know, build lineups that way. But what I do is I build a lot of manual lineups. I do use an optimizer so I can see the different randomizations of the players that I like, but I play different contests. I play some large tournament GPP, some double up, some cash, 50-50, some smaller tournament contests, and that's how I do that. So if I say lower ownership, that just means I'll have less of that player in the lineups that I build. So without further ado, let me go across the top here real quick with you because I had to abbreviate these categories. They're pretty self-explanatory, but just in case, I mean, obviously you have the name, the team, the salary. This is their targets per game for the season. This is how many fantasy points per game they're scoring. This is OPPFPGM. That's how many fantasy points per game their opponent is giving up to their position. And this is the ranking to that, the overall NFL ranking. This is their opponent. This is how many red zone targets they've had. This is ADOT is their average depth of target, whether it was the ball was caught or not. This is the average depth. This is points per snap. This is with all things that are being relevant: touchdowns, fumbles, receptions, reverses, all that's factored in. This is based on their total snaps and basically what they're worth when they're on the field. And this is the over-under on the game. My quarterbacks and wide receivers that I target, a lot of them come from the games that obviously have the higher totals. So that's where I like to start. My research is focusing on those games with the higher totals, because those are going to be the games that have the players needed for those games to be higher scoring. But that's not where I stop. I had someone reach out to me a few weeks ago and question I was using players from the Bears game. It was one of the lowest on the board. But there were some players. I look at matchups as well. I mean, if there's matchups in a game that has a 39-point total, and I think these matchups can be exploited, you know, a 20-10 game, you can still get some good fantasy points out of some players sometimes, depending on the matchups. But the higher total games is where I typically start, especially with wide receivers and quarterbacks. So without further ado, these are the wide receivers I'll be targeting in week 12. Number one, Michael Thomas. He's 9,300. I have him in yellow. He's actually kind of on the fence with me this week. He draws a tough matchup versus Bradbury for the Panthers. Even though the Panthers have a DVP of 28 versus the passing game, in the past, Bradbury and Thomas has had difficulties with that matchup. But he is averaging 11.4 targets per game. He's averaging 25.5 fantasy points per game. Carolina's given up 41.3 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position, which is 28 DVP. He's had 15 red zone targets, an average depth of target of 7.7, which is kind of low. But he averages 0.401 points per snap. Fairly high over under 47. It's the third highest on the slate. I have interest in Thomas. It's that salary that kind of pushes me away. And if that drives his ownership down, then I'll spend up to get him. A lot of people are going to not be on Thomas because he's 9,300. because they're trying to get the value below. Then I oftentimes do the opposite and spend up. That's my way of being contrarian. And the exact opposite is true. If people are spending up, sometimes they'll spend down to find value and get leverage against the field. 9,300 to get value, you need 28, 30 fantasy points, which is reachable. I mean, he's averaging 25.5 fantasy points. But the biggest matchup in this game, truthfully, is Carolina is awful against the running back position, and I feel like this would be a really big game for Alvin Kamara and Latavius Murray. So I'm not sure how much Thomas will have to do. But I have some interest. I'll have some shares of him, just not a lot compared to the others. Next up is Julio Jones, 8,000. I can never get Julio Jones right. It's the week he doesn't do any good, I've got a lot of shares of him. The week that he does do good, I don't have a lot of shares of him. But I'm back on the train this week. He's actually one of my favorite. He's $1,300 less than Thomas. He's averaging 9.1 targets per game and scoring 18.3 fantasy points per game. He's had a touchdown drought lately, similar to what he'd had last year to start off the season. But Tampa Bay is dead last against the wide receiver position. They're giving up 49.4 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver. As I mentioned, the number 32 DVP. He's received 8 red zone target, has a decent average depth of target of 13.1. He's averaging .34 fantasy points per snap, and it's the highest total on the board, 51.5 points. I have a lot of interest in Julio Jones. He's one of my favorites on the slate as far as wide receiver. It's kind of high price, 8,000, but he can get there. And as I said, I like to target the games, especially wide receivers and quarterbacks, on the games that have the higher game totals. So I have a lot of interest in Julio Jones, and he's probably going to be high ownership, which might push me away a little bit, but I will have my fair shares of him as well. Next is Tyler Lockett, and this is actually a mistake, you guys. I actually won him in yellow. I'm kind of on the fence with him, mainly because of the injury concern. And I know Seattle wants to run the ball. The thing is, Philadelphia is very stingy against the run, but they do have a number 27 ranking versus the pass. So the path to least resistance is through the air against Philadelphia. They've been playing a little bit better lately. As I mentioned, they got a 27 DVP versus the wide receiver position. They're giving up 41.1 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver. Lockett's averaging 18.6 fantasy points per game. He's averaging 7.6 targets per game. That's kind of low, but he has had a few games where he'd had double digits targets. But Josh Gordon's in town now, so he might be getting some of that. Lockett has received 14 red zone targets, has an ADOT of 10.6, and fantasy points per snap, that's kind of low, 0.283, and this second highest over under on the slate of 48. Like I said, the only thing that scares me a little bit is if Seattle does get the running game going and they do get a lead, then that 7,600 for Lockett is going to be really hard to get value out of that if they're able to lean on their running game. And another, as I mentioned, another situation is Josh Gordon's there, and Russell Wilson went to him in that San Francisco game in some key situations. Next up, Michael Evans, 7,300. He's averaging 9.7 targets per game. He is scoring 21 fantasy points per game. Atlanta is number 26 versus the wide receiver position, giving up 40.5 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver. Evans has 15 red zone targets. He's got an ADOT of 15.6, which is tied for the best on the main slate. He's averaging .315 fantasy points per snap. The highest This is the highest total on the board. Have a lot of interest in Evans. He's had a couple of really big weeks, and the only thing about him is you have to get it right when you pick between Evans and Godwin. This is a fantastic matchup for Evans, and I will be stacking pieces of this game in different ways. So I will have some shares of him. $2,000 less than Thomas, and I do like Evans more than Thomas this week in this game. And game script is going to play a big part in this too. Atlanta's been a little bit stingy the last couple weeks and had the super hero defense suddenly, but I think that's anomaly more than what's going to be the norm. And Tampa Bay likes to throw the ball all over the place. Winston averages 40 pass attempts per game, so I definitely want my shares of Evans. Right under Evans is Godwin, the other piece of the Tampa Bay passing game. He's $100 less at $7,200. He's averaging just under what Evans is at 8.9 targets per game, scoring just 0.10 less than Evans' fantasy points per game at 20.9 fantasy points per game. As I mentioned, Atlanta's number 26 versus wide receiver, giving up 40.5 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver. He's had 10 red zone targets in comparison to 15 for Evans. He's got an ADOT that's 5 yards less than what Evans is. That just means he runs shorter routes. He's averaging 0.294 fantasy points per snap, and this is the highest total on the board. So, so 3 of the top 5 are right there in the same game with Julio Jones, Mike Evans, and Chris Godwin. I have a lot of interest in all 3 of those. Next is Ridley, who's also in the same game and he's just cheaper than everyone else, $6,500. He's averaging 6.4 targets per game, which is kind of low, but he's got Julio Jones on the other side of him. And when Hooper is in there, there's a lot of mouths to feed in that offense. He had a really big week last week, and recency bias is going to drive his ownership up this week, which would probably force me to more Julio Jones. And because he's $1,500 less than Jones, that'll also drive his ownership up. Because everybody knows that Tampa Bay is the worst versus the wide receiver position. As I mentioned, giving up 49.4 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver. He has only had 4 red zone targets. He has an ADOT of 13.8, which is actually slightly better than Julio Jones. He's averaging 0.273 fantasy points per snap, and he's in the highest total game as well with Jones, Evans, and Godwin. So 4 receivers there. Take your pick. I would temper my expectations with Ridley a little bit. I think this is more of a Julio Jones game. But Ryan will probably spread the ball around. I believe the tight end Hooper has been ruled out, and so he likes to go to Julio and Ridley quite a bit. Next up is Allen Robinson. This is also one of my favorites. He's 6,500, averaging 8.6 fantasy or touches or targets per game. He's scoring 14.1 fantasy points per game. The Giants are number 31, just underneath Tampa Bay versus the wide receiver position. They're giving up 43 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver. He's had 9 red zone targets. His average depth of target is 10.6 yards, which is it's not horrible, but it's not great. It's in the middle. He's averaging 0.23 fantasy points per snap. The only thing that bothers me is this right here. It is a low total game, 40.5 points. And it's in Chicago. They've had Chicago, Trubisky mainly has had a really subpar year compared to what he was doing last year. And that's obviously affected Robinson as well. And in this game, though, he has the matchup that he has is just phenomenal. The individual matchup against the Giants defensive backs, and Trubisky likes to go to him, and he's just his Robinson's numbers are a direct result of Trubisky's numbers. Like I mentioned, Trubisky's had a down year. But I just have a feeling this is going to be the week that they come out and I thought a few weeks ago it set up really well with them against Detroit. I thought they were going to come out and exploit some things against them with the running game. And I also liked Robinson in that game, even though Slay was going to be on him. But in this game, there's really some subpar defensive backs that he'll be going up against, and he should be able to do whatever he wants. Basically, if they can't get the running game going, I think Robinson will have a huge day against the New York Giants. Next up, DJ Moore, and I actually went back and added him. He's averaging, it was 6,400. He's averaging 9.4 targets per game, scoring 15.3 fantasy points per game. New Orleans is number 20 DVP versus the wide receiver. They're giving up 37.7 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver. He's had 8 red zone targets, has an average depth of target of 10.4 yards, getting 0.238 snap points, fantasy points per snap. Third highest. Third highest total on the board. But Moore has been a target monster. He had 15 targets last week. And this could be a similar game script. They're a 9.5 point underdog. They're going to, so that tells you they're expected to be behind. And I would probably prefer to use him as a piece of a game stack with that New Orleans and Carolina game. Allen had a horrible game last week, and of course you always have to contend with McCaffrey, and he demands a huge part of their offense. But Moore has he's just been targeted. I believe it's actually 26 targets in the last 2 games and 15 last week. So, like his price compared to the others, and if this game can get going back and forth, and the true way to move the ball against New Orleans is to put it in the air. He could draw Lattimore, which would cause you to temper your expectations a little bit, but that just totally depends on the matchup. Next is Jarvis Landry from Cleveland. I did skip Beckham. I just wasn't crazy about Beckham's price and this game script. I really think it's probably going to go through Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt. But the thing to do against Miami this year has use all your skill players. I mean, last week it was Josh Allen and John Brown who, smashed pretty good against Miami. This week you got Mayfield, Beckham, Landry, Chubb. And there's a couple things here. This is a revenge game for Landry going back against Miami. It's his birthday, and just all kinds of narratives that you can fit in there. And I like the pivot off of Beckham. They both have phenomenal matchups and getting basically the same amount of targets, but Landry is, $700 less. And I like him. He's getting 8.6 targets per game. He's scoring 14.1 fantasy points per game. Miami is number 17 versus wide receiver position, giving up 37.4 fantasy points per game. They're a little bit better because they get smashed on the ground. He's had 14 red zone targets compared to only 6 for Beckham. He has an average depth of target of 8.6, so he's not getting downfield that far. But Mayfield does look for him in the red zone, obviously. He's scoring 0.22 fantasy points per snap, and as I mentioned, the game total is 44.5 points. Next up is Jamison Crowder. He's been an absolute target monster for Sam Darnold. He's 6,200. His prices really went up the last few weeks. He's averaging 7.2 targets per game. He's only scoring 12.8 fantasy points per game. They're not really a juggernaut offense. They're not scoring a lot of touchdowns. Did pretty well last week. Oakland's number 22 versus the pass. They're giving up 39 point. They're number 22 versus wide receiver. They're giving up 39.3 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver. He's had 8 red zone targets. He has an average depth of target of 8.6 yards. He scored .256 fantasy points per snap. And it's kind of just a middle, doesn't really scare you away or doesn't excite you. Over under 46.5 points. This is the game that I think could be this sneaky shootout. The Jets are stingy against the run. They're beat up on defense. So Oakland might have to put the ball in the air. And I think the Jets are going to have to put the ball in the air as well. And this could include a lot of attention to Le'Veon Bell, getting him the ball through the passing game out of the backfield. So I definitely have interest in him. I've not, as I said, not crazy about the 6,200 salary. I mean, you got to get 20 fantasy points for value, so that's the part that kind of scares me off a little bit. Excuse me. Next up, same game, Tyrell Williams. Jets are number 30, have a number 30 DVP versus the wide receiver position. They're giving up 42.6 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver. It's mediocre, as I mentioned, for Crowder. Mediocre game total. He is the guy that Carr likes to go to. He's only averaging 5.4 targets per game. He had some games that he missed and was out, and Carr really leaned on the tight end Waller. Williams is averaging 13.7 fantasy points per game. And as I mentioned, the Jets are number 30 versus the wide receiver, and they're giving up 42.6 fantasy points per game. He has an ADOT of 15. He's had 6 red zone targets, and he's averaging .246 fantasy points per snap. Excuse me. And the Jets have been having trouble with the outside wide receiver routes, deep routes. They've been having problems with that. And as I mentioned, they're really beat up on defense. And if Carr has a chance to get the ball down the field, Williams could be a real good play, especially at the 5,900. Next is Tyler Boyd. And for me, this is just a hunch. He's 5,000. He's getting 9.3 targets per game. He averages 13 fantasy points per game. Pittsburgh is one of the best against the pass. They have a DVP of 12 versus the wide receiver position. They're only giving up 34.2 fantasy points to wide receivers. He's had 4 red zone targets because they don't get in the red zone much. His average depth of target is 7.2 yards, which is low. And he has .205 points per snap average. Really low over-under on this game. I got him in yellow. I'm going to have some small shares of him. I'm going to tell you, I live in Ohio. I am a Dallas Cowboys fan, though. I'm not a Bengals fan at all. This is the Cincinnati Bengals Super Bowl. They are 0-10. They're playing at home. They're playing against their fiercest rival. Cincinnati does not like Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh does not like Cincinnati. I think they are going to go all out. I'm not saying they're going to win, but I wouldn't be surprised if they did pull off a big-time upset in this game. I mean, Pittsburgh is coming off that big old helmet loss to Cleveland. But if they've taken Cincinnati for granted, it might be up against it this week. Finley was really accurate quarterback in college. He's been not so great in his first few starts, but he's a rookie. And if AJ Green was active, I think that would make Boyd even more uh, viable. But Green obviously isn't active, and so teams focus a lot on stopping Tyler Boyd. But I'm going to have some small shares of him. I got him in yellow, but he's the kind of wide receiver that could pop up in a large tournament GPP and smash, and kudos to the people that have him. But be really careful. I mean, they are definitely Pittsburgh's definitely the better team, but I've seen it, and you've probably seen it too. The better team doesn't always win in the NFL. I think they should be really careful. As I said, this is Cincinnati's Super Bowl. Next is Robbie Anderson from the Jets. Getting back to the things that I said about Crowder and Williams, Anderson's only 4,800. Oakland's number 22 versus the wide receiver position, giving up 39.3 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver. Anderson's only averaged 5.3 targets per game, scoring 7.6 fantasy points per game. He's only had 3 red zone targets. He has an average depth of target of 14.3 yards. He's only got a .131 points per snap. And as I mentioned on the others, it's a mediocre over and under. But could be sneaky and a nice pivot off Crowder. Crowder was in the top 5 in ownership last week and probably going to come back to him this week as well. A lot of people will. Next is A.J. Brown from Tennessee. This is the best matchup for Tennessee versus Trey Herndon. The thing about this is I really think this is going to be a Derrick Henry, Leonard Fournette game. And the game total really scares me at 41. But this would be the matchup that Tennessee would want to try to exploit is Brown versus Herndon. Brown's averaging 4.5 targets per game, 9.2 fantasy points per game. Jacksonville's pretty stingy versus the pass. They're number 13, but their weak spot is where Herndon's at. They only give up 33.9 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver. He's had 5 red zone targets, got a mediocre depth of target, 11.9 yards, and averages .243 fantasy points per snap. So that wraps up the wide receiver position for week 12. Recapping the wide receivers I will be targeting in week 12. Just go over here to the left. Michael Thomas, I'm just going to have lower shares of him. The salary and some other matchups I think are going to be exploited more than Thomas. Julio Jones, one of my favorites. Tyler Lockett, Evans, and Godwin from the Atlanta-Tampa Bay game. I want a lot of exposure to that game. Calvin Ridley, I'm sure everybody else does too. Robinson from the Bears, he's another favorite of mine this week. DJ Moore could be real interesting depending on if Lattimore follows him around. Landry from Cleveland, Crowder from the Jets, Tyrell Williams from Oakland, Tyler Boyd, just a hunch. Yellow on the fence, I'm just going to have some small shares of him. Robbie Anderson from the Jets, and A.J. Brown from Tennessee. I will weed out the ownership and injury concerns when I do the lineup building tomorrow and may add or subtract. I don't do much of that once I'm pretty set. A good way to follow this chart, obviously, is where you got to get a lot of green, like Evans and Julio and things like that. But you always want to find a way to differentiate yourself, no matter what kind of contest you're in. How can you get leverage? As I mentioned in the top scoring last week compared to the top projected, the top scoring, 2 of them were the number 2 wide receivers to 2 of the top projected. Ridley to Jones, and Gallup to Cooper. So you got to look at those type of things too. If a lot of attention is going to go to the number one, maybe you want the number two. And you're not as good as you were last week, nor are you as bad as you are last week. So always remember that when thinking about recency bias. I want to thank you guys for joining me. I hope this information is some value to you. Feel free to use this chart as a guide, however you like. And as I mentioned, screenshot it, pause the video, do whatever you want to do to use it. I encourage you to drop any comments or opinions below. If there's something you'd like to see with this chart, something you'd like me to add, I'll see what I can do. Like I said, feel free to drop any uh, comments that you may have below. It helps me out a lot if you guys share this video, like it, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. My subscribers have been trending upwards slowly, but they're trending upwards. My viewership has definitely been going up, especially my showdown videos. So I really appreciate you guys tuning in to me. I'll be back tomorrow with the tight end defense special teams video, and then I'll be following that up with the lineup building. You're not going to want to miss that, where we take all the players that I've put in the player pool that have been generated on these videos that I've done. I've done quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, defense, special teams, and we put them all together and put a nice big bow and put them under the tree for Sunday, and hopefully do some winning. I want to thank you one more time. My name is Ty Patton. This is all about winning daily fantasy sports, and I'll see you tomorrow. Thanks a lot.